The morning air hung heavy over Somerset Street in New Brunswick, New Jersey. In the summer of 1954, sunlight filtered weakly through thick, leafy branches, creating long, uneven shadows that danced across the cracked sidewalks. In one small, neatly kept house, a soft sound of tiny footsteps echoed through the hallway, each one hesitant and careful, yet full of the small, bright energy of a child. Victoria Powell, just 3 years old, moved through her home with a quiet curiosity, her light blonde curls catching the sun, her blue eyes wide and observant, drinking in every texture, every color, every sound. Her world was small but vibrant. A wooden doll, slightly worn from countless afternoons of imagined adventures, sat tucked beneath the kitchen table where she often perched, whispering secrets only she could hear. The soft hum of her mother in the background, the familiar scrape of her father's shoes on the porch, and the faint scent of honeysuckle spilling from the garden all framed her days with a sense of comfort that seemed unshakable. And yet, beneath the innocence, there was a subtle tension. Victoria sometimes froze mid-step, staring at an ordinary corner of the room, as though it held a shadow only she could see. She would bite her lip quietly and then shake herself free of the feeling, returning to her games with a fragile resilience, as if she already knew that the world had moments she could not control. The neighborhood was calm in the way post-war suburbia could be calm, with bicycles leaning against white picket fences and the distant laughter of children carried on warm breezes. But even here, in this gentle, unassuming street, there were edges. A neighbor's bark that startled her, the sudden roar of a passing car, or the way the shadows moved longer than seemed natural in the late afternoon. These small, inexplicable moments created flickers of worry in Victoria's young mind. She was drawn to the flowers that lined the front yards, running her small fingers over petals as if to absorb their quiet reassurance. She loved to press her face into the sun-warmed grass and imagine herself soaring above the rooftops, away from anything that could frighten her. Her parents watched her with a tender mix of pride and anxiety. Her mother, gentle and precise in her daily tasks, often caught Victoria staring off into corners of the room, her brows knitting in ways too serious for her age. Her father, a quiet man with a soft voice, would crouch beside her, lifting her tiny hands to brush off imagined specks of dust or invisible threats. They didn't know that these small moments, innocent as they seemed, were part of the delicate emotional terrain of a child navigating both curiosity and instinctual fear. Victoria's days were punctuated by small rituals that gave her life rhythm and predictability. Morning milk and toast, the careful arrangement of her toys into precise little patterns, the soft repetition of songs hummed under her breath as she played alone. These patterns were comforting, but also a form of quiet armor. She carried within her a sensitivity that made her world feel both larger and more precarious than anyone around her could fully see. Each dandelion she picked, each bug she followed across the garden, was a tiny act of courage, a delicate claim of control in a life she was only beginning to understand. Evening brought a different kind of quiet. The sun lowered into a molten horizon, and shadows deepened, pooling in corners of rooms and along the edges of her small backyard. Victoria would sit by the screen door, looking out at the street that hummed with cicadas, tracing imaginary patterns in the fading light. There was a longing in those moments, a quiet ache for a world that felt just beyond reach, a yearning that was too vast for a 3-year-old to name. She sometimes clutched her wooden doll closer than usual, as though drawing courage from its familiar weight, whispering to it softly, hoping to understand what she could not yet put into words. It was in these hours that the emotional undercurrents of her small life were most visible. There was a fragility beneath the bright curiosity, a smallness to her heart that sought safety and understanding in a world that was otherwise vast and unknowable. Those who watched her could see the sparkle of intelligence and imagination, But the shadows that flickered in her eyes hinted at a silent awareness, an early understanding of vulnerability that would later make the unraveling of her world so devastating. Her parents often paused in their routines just to watch her, noting how she hesitated at the threshold of the garden, or how her small fingers lingered on the edge of a flower petal before plucking it. Each movement was careful, deliberate, full of the unspoken inner life that defined her brief existence. The tenderness of those days, the soft laughter, the fleeting moments of quiet fear, all became fragments of a life that would soon be shattered in ways no one could have imagined. Victoria Powell's world was a mosaic of innocence and precarity, small adventures and private fears, of joy that shimmered alongside an unarticulated awareness of danger. In the golden warmth of a 1954 summer, she carried both the light of childhood and the quiet shadows that no one could chase away. And in those shadows, the first whispers of tragedy had already begun to stir. Where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it there? Victoria Powell's days unfolded like delicate rituals, each one a fragile thread in the fabric of her small life. Morning sunlight would spill across the bedroom floor, and she would wake with a quiet murmur, her small body curling under the warmth of her blanket before slipping into the familiar rhythm of the day. Her parents' voices called gently from the kitchen, the aroma of toast and coffee drifting through the hallway, mingling with the faint scent of soap and powder that clung to the walls. Victoria would rise, barefoot, her tiny toes brushing the cool wood, and shuffle toward the sounds, clutching her beloved wooden doll as if it could anchor her to safety in the unpredictable currents of the world. Her mother guided her through the simple routines of breakfast and dressing, each moment an exercise in gentle instruction. Buttons were fastened, braids adjusted, and Victoria would sometimes pause, her eyes distant, a quiet frown softening her small face, as though she were absorbing invisible weights from the air. It was in these moments of pause that the depth of her inner life became most apparent. She carried small worries that she did not yet have words for, fears that flickered and faded like shadows at dusk, leaving only the memory of unease. Her father's soft chuckles or careful reminders grounded her, but the child's intuition sensed the fragility of the world around her, and she approached each new task with a tentative care that seemed beyond her years. The neighborhood provided a canvas for her exploration. Somerset Street, with its neat lawns, white fences, and gently creaking sidewalks, became a space both comforting and unknowable. Victoria wandered carefully along the paths, collecting dandelions in her small hands and arranging them into invisible patterns on the grass, a secret garden of tiny triumphs and small discoveries. Every crack in the sidewalk, every rustling bush, every passing car became a point of fascination, and yet also a source of quiet vigilance. She was learning early that the world had textures both gentle and harsh, and that even in safety, one must remain aware. Her friends, few and similarly young, shared moments of laughter and tentative play. Victoria's shy smile often preceded a cautious approach, and she would observe before joining, hands folded over her doll as though seeking counsel. There was a careful negotiation in these interactions, a balancing act between the instinct to connect and a subtle wariness of unpredictability. Her social world, though small, mirrored the delicate boundaries she navigated within her own heart. The line between trust and caution constantly drawn and redrawn with each passing encounter. Even within her family, Victoria carried a private world. Bedtime stories read aloud by her mother, the gentle squeeze of her father's hand at the threshold of night, these were not mere comforts but anchors. Yet beneath the lullabies and whispered reassurances, she held a quiet longing, a wish to understand, to be understood, to grasp the larger shapes of life that remained just out of reach. In the tiny diary of her mind, she recorded, without words, moments of confusion, moments of joy, moments of fear. She remembered the smell of the garden after rain, The feel of her doll's wooden arms against her chest, the sound of her father humming softly in the distance. These were her treasures, pieces of a fragile internal landscape that belonged only to her. Victoria's curiosity extended to the textures and rhythms of her surroundings. She would press her palms against the rough bark of trees, trace the edges of windowsills, and listen intently to the distant hum of engines on the main road. Every sensation was an opportunity to understand the world, and yet each brought a flicker of uncertainty. She learned, perhaps instinctively, that the ordinary could hold hidden surprises, and that vigilance, however small, was a tool for survival. The balance of wonder and caution defined her days, shaping her quiet resilience in ways no one could yet measure. Her parents' love, tender and constant, could not shield her from the small bruises of daily life, stumbles on uneven sidewalks, sudden loud noises, the occasional scolding. But these moments, minor as they seemed, layered themselves into her emotional awareness, teaching her both trust and caution, hope and apprehension. Victoria's world was rich in textures, both external and internal, and she navigated it with a careful attentiveness, a subtle wisdom that belied her 3 years. Evenings brought a different cadence. The sun lowered into a warm haze, casting long shadows across the lawns, and Victoria would linger on the porch, holding her doll, tracing the shapes of clouds in the sky, or watching the flicker of fireflies across the grass. There was a quiet melancholy in these hours, a subtle awareness of the impermanence of moments, a longing for stability that she clung to with all her small heart. Her parents, aware only of the child's natural curiosity, often watched with gentle smiles, unaware of the depth of her contemplations. The careful balance she maintained between wonder and apprehension. Victoria's emotional world was delicate and intricate. She carried within her a mixture of exuberance and fragility, trust and hesitation, delight and unspoken anxiety. Each day was a series of small victories and tiny negotiations with reality, each one a testament to her inner resilience. She was a child who felt deeply, who observed keenly, and who carried the subtle tensions of her brief life with a quiet dignity. And beneath it all, in the gentle hum of Somerset Street, in the soft weight of her parents' presence, in the secret spaces of her small mind, there was a quiet foreshadowing of the upheaval to come. A sense that the fragile threads of her world, so carefully woven, would soon be tested in ways no one could yet imagine. And if stories like this keep you pulled in, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss what comes next. In the days leading up to her disappearance, a subtle shift rippled through Victoria Powell's world. The air carried a heavier warmth, a thick humidity that made the sunlight seem almost liquid as it pooled across Somerset Street. Victoria moved through her home with the same tender curiosity, yet there was a new hesitation in her steps, a fleeting pause at doorways, a sudden clench of her tiny fists before she allowed herself to continue. Even her parents, attuned to the rhythms of a 3-year-old, sensed the quiet unease settling into the corners of their home. Though they could not name its source, her play became more insular. Where she once ran freely along the sidewalks, chasing imaginary friends or collecting dandelions, now she lingered closer to the house, her wooden doll pressed against her chest as if it could shield her from invisible forces. She watched shadows more intently, following their movements with a concentration that seemed beyond her years. The soft hum of cicadas outside her window was no longer just a backdrop to her summer. It became an accompaniment to her private vigilance. Small noises startled her more easily, the squeak of a floorboard or the distant bark of a dog sending her to clutch her mother's skirts. Seeking reassurance she could not yet articulate, even the sunlight, once a constant comfort, seemed to take on a strange, uneven quality. The way it streaked across the lawn, the way it hit the porch swing just so, created patterns that flickered and shifted in ways that drew Victoria's gaze again and again. She would kneel in the grass, tracing the dandelions she had picked that morning, lining them carefully beside her doll, whispering to herself softly. Her voice was a fragile thread of sound, barely carrying beyond her own small bubble of attention. She was making sense of the world in the only way she knew how, creating patterns and rituals that grounded her in a reality that now felt subtly unstable. Interactions with her parents took on a quiet intensity. Her mother noticed the small frowns, the sudden silences that would stretch too long before she offered a smile or a question. Her father saw the way Victoria would sometimes cling to the doorway, as though checking that the room remained safe, as though anticipating an unseen presence. There were fleeting moments when she would look toward the street outside, eyes wide, almost searching, and then quickly lower her gaze as if she had glimpsed something she was not meant to see. These moments, small and almost imperceptible, carried a weight that neither parent could fully comprehend. The neighborhood itself seemed unchanged, serene in the warmth of summer, yet Victoria's perception of it had shifted. A friend's distant laughter, the creak of a neighbor's gate, the soft whisper of the wind through the trees, all of these now carried an undercurrent of unpredictability. She moved with caution, dipping her fingers into the grass or picking a flower only after careful inspection, her childlike curiosity tempered by a sense of vigilance. It was as if her mind, delicate and observant, had caught a faint signal of imbalance in the ordinary world, and she responded in the only way she could, with subtle pauses, careful movements, and private rituals of reassurance. Sleep, too, was changing. Nights that had once been punctuated by soft dreams and gentle breathing now held brief moments of unrest. Victoria would stir in her crib, a small whimper escaping her lips, eyes blinking against the shadows that pooled in the corners of her room. Her parents would check on her, soothing her back to calm with gentle words and a hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Yet, as they watched her finally drift into quiet again, they sensed an unease lingering in the room, as if the very air had thickened with unspoken tension. The days themselves were stretching longer, each one a slow progression of small observations and careful navigation. Victoria's attention to detail deepened. She would line up her toys with meticulous precision, arrange her dolls in small tableaux, and whisper to them, as though sharing a private understanding of the world's hidden rhythms. The garden became a place of both comfort and vigilance. She crouched among the flowers, her fingers brushing petals with care, tracing leaves with the gentlest of touches, always alert to the wind, the shadows, the subtle changes that hinted at an uncertainty beyond her comprehension. And yet, even in this heightened awareness, her innocence persisted. Victoria laughed softly when a butterfly landed near her small giggle like a bell in the summer air. She marveled at the swirl of clouds in the late afternoon sky, the way they seemed to move slowly, deliberately, across the blue expanse. In these fleeting moments, the child within hers, the brightness, the curiosity, the unyielding sense of wonder shone through the tension, reminding the world that even on the cusp of tragedy, innocence can persist in delicate defiance. Her final days were therefore a fragile balance of light and shadow. Curiosity and caution intertwined in every step she took. Each glance toward a corner, each hesitation at a doorway, each whispered secret to her wooden doll, carried a weight beyond her years. A quiet preparation for a reality that none of them could yet see approaching. Victoria was navigating her small life with a subtle acuity, sensing the fragility of the world around her while still clinging to the wonder that made her so vibrantly alive. Somerset Street seemed to hold its breath during these days, the quiet suburban rhythms masking the tension that had settled into one little house. Victoria Powell moved through this space with all the cautious attention of a child who already felt the edges of danger. Her blue eyes wide and searching, her curls brushing the sunlit floor, her tiny hands always holding something to steady herself. The tension, though invisible to all but her, was growing like a slow undercurrent beneath the calm surface of a summer river dot, and as the final evening approached, with its long shadows and the soft golden haze of sunset, the stage for heartbreak was quietly set. Victoria clutched her wooden doll to her chest and looked toward the fading light outside, sensing the edges of a world that would soon transform entirely. Her last days were a portrait of fragile awareness, tender courage, and the quiet, unspoken fears of a small child on the cusp of unimaginable loss. The day Victoria Powell vanished began like any other summer morning, yet the air carried a weight that seemed to press against the edges of Somerset Street. Sunlight draped the lawns in gold, but the warmth felt heavier somehow, clinging to skin and clothes, thickening the space between houses. Victoria moved through her small home with the usual delicate curiosity, but there was a subtle tautness in her movements, a watchfulness that had grown sharper over the preceding days. Every corner, every doorway, every faint sound became a point of attention. A test of the fragile world, she knew. Her mother was in the kitchen, the faint clatter of dishes mixing with the distant hum of traffic from the main road. Her father was repairing a loose hinge on the back gate, the rhythmic scrape of metal against wood blending into the quiet soundtrack of a suburban morning. Victoria followed her routine with precision, collecting her doll, checking the alignment of her toys, whispering to herself as she often did. Yet today, something invisible had shifted. The patterns that had offered comfort now seemed insufficient, and a flicker of unease passed over her small face as she looked toward the open door. When she stepped outside, the familiar neighborhood held an unsettling stillness. The trees swayed lazily in the gentle breeze. The cicadas hummed their constant drone, but there was an unusual emptiness in the street. Victoria's blue eyes scanned the edges of the houses, the spaces between fences, the shadowed alcoves where light did not reach. Her tiny hand gripped her doll tighter, her curls brushing her shoulders as she moved carefully across the sidewalk. Each step was measured, deliberate, yet still carried the soft exuberance of a child, exploring a world she loved but did not fully understand. The neighborhood dogs barked in the distance, sharp bursts of sound that made Victoria pause, her small body stiffening. A neighbor's screen door slammed with the suddenness of wind, and she jumped, whispering to herself, pressing her doll to her chest as if it could shield her from the unpredictable. It was in these small ruptures of the ordinary that the tension of the day began to coil tighter around her dot as the morning stretched into early afternoon. Victoria wandered toward the garden at the side of the house, her curiosity tempered by vigilance. She knelt among the flowers, brushing petals with delicate fingers, arranging small clusters of dandelions as if orchestrating a secret ceremony. And yet, her attention frequently flicked toward the edges of the street, toward spaces where the sun did not reach, where shadows pooled and shifted. There was a tiny frown, barely perceptible, that settled over her brow, a quiet signal that something in the rhythm of the day had altered. The sequence of events that followed would forever remain etched in the memory of the street, though no one could reconstruct it in complete clarity. A brief absence, a step taken toward the unknown, and the child who had navigated her world with cautious curiosity was suddenly unmoored. Her parents, distracted for only moments by routine tasks, turned to find the space where Victoria had been now empty. The backyard, once full of playful energy and small movements, felt suddenly hollow, a quiet void pressing against the familiar shapes of home. The initial panic unfolded in subtle, almost surreal increments. First came the calling of her name, a gentle inquiry that soon turned urgent, reverberating through the quiet street. Her father ran to the corners of the property, peering over fences, scanning the familiar sidewalks for the small figure who had vanished without a trace. Her mother's voice grew louder, frantic, carrying across lawns, trembling against the heat of the summer air. Each unanswered call deepened the tension, a growing sense that the ordinary protections of home and family had been breached. Neighbors began to emerge, drawn by the rising strain, their own senses tingling with unease as they joined in the search. The quiet of Somerset Street fractured, replaced by the low hum of concern and whispered speculation. Children who had played with Victoria just days before now clutched their own toys more tightly, sensing, without understanding, that the familiar world had tilted on its axis. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with an emotional weight that pressed against every doorway, every fence, every unshadowed corner dot as the afternoon passed. The desperation intensified. Searchers moved methodically, yet the child remained elusive. Her wooden doll, once a comforting companion, became a haunting reminder of absence as it was discovered lying in the grass near the porch, untouched, incongruously still. The small patterns of her life, so carefully maintained, were shattered, leaving only empty space and the echoes of a tiny presence that had been vibrant only hours before. The collapse of normalcy hit first in small, intimate ways. Her parents, stunned and frantic, were caught between hope and despair, unable to reconcile the bright child who had wandered the garden that morning with the void that now filled her absence. Their voices, soft and pleading, broke against the edges of silence that stretched across the street. The shadows in the corners of rooms seemed darker, the familiar sounds of summer carrying a tension that had not existed before. By evening, Somerset Street had transformed. The air, once warm and golden, now carried a creeping chill, the sun dipping low and casting long, oppressive shadows. Windows reflected the growing worry inside each house and the neighborhood. Once a safe backdrop for childhood exploration, now seemed to contain hidden threats in every unlit corner. Victoria Powell's disappearance had ruptured the delicate rhythm of life, replacing the ordinary cadence of summer with a tense, suspended uncertainty. Every heartbeat in the Powell household echoed the enormity of loss before it could even be named. The day had begun with curiosity and the warmth of innocence and ended in a vacuum of absence, leaving only questions, echoes, and the unbearable weight of what might have happened to the small child with light blonde curls and shy blue eyes. The investigation into Victoria Powell's disappearance began as a whisper in the early evening, but it soon grew into a roar that consumed Somerset Street. Her parents, fragile and trembling, became central figures in the story that had shattered the ordinary fabric of their lives. The police arrived first, their shoes crunching on the warm asphalt, clipboards in hand, voices calm but edged with urgency. Each question they asked carried a weight that seemed almost unbearable, slicing through the tension that had settled over the household. Like a persistent fog, neighbors were gathered on their porches, drawn by the rising commotion, their eyes wide with concern. Somerset Street, once a quiet enclave of post-war suburban life, now throbbed with the collective anxiety of its residents. Adults murmured to one another in low tones, children clung to their parents, and the ordinary noises of the evening, the creak of swings, the hum of cicadas, the distant barking of dogs took on a strange, sinister resonance. It was as if the world itself had shifted, becoming attentive and watchful, waiting for the small details to reveal what had happened. The police methodically began their search, moving from the Powell house to the edges of the neighborhood, their eyes scanning every bush, every alley, every shadowed corner. Flashlights cut swaths through the gathering dusk, illuminating ordinary spaces that now felt ominous. Victoria's mother followed closely, hands trembling as she gestured toward the spaces her daughter had occupied just hours before. Her father moved silently alongside, his jaw tight, eyes scanning the dimming lawns as if he could will the child back into existence. Each unturned leaf, each unsearched corner, magnified the weight of absence pressing into the evening. Clues, when they appeared, were fragile and fleeting. A single dandelion crushed beneath a sidewalk crack. A small footprint in the soft soil by the garden. A whisper of a toy rolling into the shade. All these details were gathered carefully, cataloged, and examined, each one carrying both hope and despair. Every small discovery was a double-edged reminder of the vibrant life that had vanished and the terrifying reality of the unknown that now stretched before them. The town itself became entangled in the investigation. Somerset Street, a place of quiet familiarity, was now alive with speculation and dread. Neighbors described fleeting glimpses of movement, sounds they had previously ignored, and sensations of unease they could not place. Everyone's memory became a potential lead, every observation a possible clue. And the ordinary textures of daily life, the breeze, the leaves, the patterns of sunlight were now imbued with a weighty, almost unbearable significance. Within the Powell household, the strain deepened. Her mother's movements grew precise and deliberate, each action measured to avoid another overwhelming surge of panic. She would move through rooms, adjusting toys, arranging chairs, checking closets, not for tidiness, but for the comfort of repetition and the faint hope of retracing Victoria's steps. Her father spent hours on the porch, scanning the edges of the street, tracing the path Victoria might have taken, each imagined route twisting tighter around his chest. Together, they inhabited a world of perpetual anticipation, a delicate oscillation between hope and despair that frayed the edges of their hearts with every passing hour. Investigators began interviewing neighbors, charting the layout of the neighborhood, compiling lists of who had been outside, who had seen what, and when. The slow accumulation of evidence carried its own emotional weight, each detail a potential revelation, each question a dagger of uncertainty. The ordinary routines of Somerset Street were disrupted, replaced by a tense choreography of search parties, whispered updates, and the ever-present awareness of a missing child. Evenings were the hardest. The long shadows, the sudden hush of the street, the way the wind rustled through the trees, all became reminders of the fragility of life and the absence that now defined the Powell home. Victoria's room, still filled with her carefully arranged toys and her small wooden doll, became a sacred space, a quiet monument to her brief existence. Each item told a story of tenderness and vigilance, of a child navigating a world full of beauty and subtle peril. Now frozen in memory, as investigators sought to unravel the mystery that had stolen her from those who loved her most. And yet, even amid the rising tension, hope persisted. Every footstep in the grass, every call through the neighborhood, every shadow examined with care, held the faint possibility that Victoria might be found, returned to the arms that ached for her. That hope, however tenuous, became the driving force of the investigation, a fragile thread connecting despair to the possibility of resolution. Searchlights cut through the thickening dusk, sweeping across lawns, gardens, and sidewalks, illuminating ordinary objects now laden with emotional weight. Officers moved methodically, questioning witnesses, examining every potential lead, each action carried out with the awareness that the smallest detail could tip the balance between discovery and continued absence. The air was heavy with sweat, dust, and the lingering scent of crushed flowers in the garden, a sensory tapestry intertwined with tension and grief. Amid it all, the human element, the strain on parents, the quiet dread of neighbors, the small flickers of memory that might hold significance became central. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle in the bushes, every glimpse of something out of place drew the eye and tightened the chest. Somerset Street, once a backdrop for gentle summer afternoons, had become a stage for fear, longing, and relentless uncertainty. If you want to know what investigators uncovered next, go ahead and like this video. The years that followed Victoria Powell's disappearance cast a long, unrelenting shadow over Somerset Street and the Powell family. The investigation had grown cold quickly, leaving behind a tapestry of unanswered questions, tentative theories, and the persistent ache of absence. Each day that passed without resolution added layers to the emotional burden her parents carried, shaping their lives with a quiet but inexorable grief that seeped into every corner of their home and every thought they could not escape. Her mother, once radiant in the careful rhythms of domestic life, now moved through rooms with a hollow precision. She would arrange the toys as Victoria had left them, align the dolls just so, whispering into the empty spaces as if the act itself could summon the child back. Her father, who had once watched the neighborhood with measured attentiveness, now wandered the streets in silence, retracing footsteps that no longer existed. Haunted by the faintest recollection of dandelions pressed into grass or the small curl of Victoria's hair as she leaned toward a flower. Every object, every corner, became a repository of memory and guilt. A reminder of a life interrupted too soon. Neighbors spoke less and less of the incident, retreating into the quiet routines of their own lives, yet none could forget entirely. Each passing summer brought back the sounds and sights of that day, the warm hum of cicadas, the stretch of sunlight across lawns, the sudden hush when a child's laughter failed to answer the call. The street itself seemed to carry the weight of what had occurred, its familiar textures now tinged with unease. Every shadowed corner and flicker of movement became a potential fragment of memory, a subtle echo of loss that could pierce even the strongest resolve. For Victoria's parents, every anniversary, every seasonal shift, was an emotional minefield. The summer when she disappeared left an indelible mark, and the recollections of her final days replayed like fragile film reels in their minds. They remembered the slight hesitations in her steps, the careful placement of her toys, the soft murmurs she spoke to her doll. These fragments of a brief life carried a weight that only expanded with time, layering grief with the haunting question of what could have been done differently, what might have been noticed, and who could have intervened. Guilt became a constant companion. Her mother would linger over the slightest imagined oversight, a door left open, a glance diverted, replaying the day in endless permutations. Her father's mind twisted through the possibilities relentlessly, haunted by the notion that a single misstep could have altered everything. Each remembered sound, each shadow in memory, became a potential clue, a personal indictment, a haunting reminder that their child had been lost in an instant while the world went on oblivious. The town's memory of Victoria Powell was less intimate but no less poignant. Somerset Street retained a quiet solemnity, a collective awareness that a bright presence had been stolen. Some neighbors whispered of seeing fleeting figures at dusk, of shadows that moved too quickly, of lights that blinked in patterns that felt familiar yet impossible. Others carried the story silently, a cautionary echo in the background of ordinary lives. The street itself became a slow witness to absence, its lawns and fences holding traces of grief that could not be erased by time alone. Official records grew cold, files thickening with dust, leads growing faint, and the promise of resolution slipping further from reach. Investigators rotated in and out, each one approaching the case with careful diligence, but eventually leaving as frustration mounted and tangible. Progress remained elusive. Yet even as the trail cooled, the emotional residue intensified. Every unanswered question, every unexamined possibility became a silent echo in the minds of those left behind. Grief hardened into ritual-checking closets, peering under tables, calling her name into empty spaces. Acts of hope and despair entwined into daily life. Within the Powell home, life continued with a fragile normalcy. Meals were prepared, chores completed, beds made, windows cleaned, and yet every movement carried the imprint of absence. The laughter of other children in the neighborhood brought both relief and pangs of longing, a bittersweet reminder of what Victoria had brought to the street and the void left in her wake. Every sound of footsteps on the porch, every creak in the floorboards became charged with meaning, filtered through decades of memory and the unhealed wound of loss. Friends and extended family spoke sparingly, uncertain of what could be said without deepening the sorrow. Visits were measured, conversations cautious, each word chosen to avoid reopening an emotional scar that refused to close. Yet even in the careful quiet, the presence of absence was undeniable. A persistent reminder that the child who had once navigated the world with delicate curiosity had vanished, leaving behind only fragile fragments of memory and the ever-present ache of what might have been. Time itself became a lens for reflection and torment. Photographs yellowed in the Powell home, capturing the bright eyes, soft curls, and small hands of a life frozen in memory. Letters, notes, and mementos became sacred, carrying both the weight of love and the sharp sting of what could never return. Each object was a doorway to grief, a tangible reminder of a child who had lived and laughed and dreamed, only to be stolen by forces unseen. And amid it all, the quiet question persisted, pressing against the silence like a whispered accusation. Who could have intervened, and what might have been known too late? The cold case became not just a matter of law and procedure, but a profound emotional landscape, a terrain of grief, guilt, and longing that stretched across decades. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? Decades of quiet anguish finally gave way to fragments of revelation. After years of dead ends and fading leads, a new thread began to emerge, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like the soft rustle of leaves that hints at a hidden presence. Someone remembered a fleeting encounter, a shadow in the wrong place at the wrong time, a moment that had been dismissed but now carried weight. The long-buried truths that had lain dormant for so many years began to surface, fragile yet undeniable, pulling the past toward the light of acknowledgement. It was a neighbor, long silent and hesitant, who finally spoke. Their voice, trembling with the weight of memory and fear, carried details that had been locked away behind decades of hesitation. Names whispered under breath, small movements once overlooked, the faintest traces of a presence that had gone unnoticed. These fragments began to reconstruct a picture that had remained obscured for far too long. Each revelation was a delicate balance, shocking, yet meticulously precise, as if the truth had been waiting for the courage to step forward, waiting for someone to finally give it shape. For the Powell family, the breakthrough was both relief and torment. Relief that the silence surrounding their daughter's disappearance was beginning to fracture. Torment in realizing that the details were far darker and more complex than they could have imagined. Memories long suppressed resurfaced in waves, the echo of small footsteps, the texture of her curls in their hands, the fleeting shadow in the corner of a room. And these memories, once private, now aligned with new fragments of fact, forming a narrative they had both feared and sought for decades. Investigators, old and new, followed the delicate trail with meticulous care. Records that had seemed insignificant were revisited. Evidence once dismissed was now scrutinized through fresh eyes. Photographs, notes, and witness statements were re-evaluated, revealing patterns that had been invisible in the haste and confusion of the initial investigation. The quiet emotional tension that had gripped the neighborhood for decades became a living, pressing force as the community confronted the reality that the threads of truth had always existed, waiting only to be gathered and understood. The breakthrough carried with it a raw intensity. The neighbor's recollections, offered with hesitation and vulnerability, became central. Details of a small figure moving near the edge of sight, of brief conversations overheard and long forgotten, of objects slightly out of place, all combined into a tapestry that, illuminated not only the sequence of events, but also the emotional weight that had been carried in silence. Every whispered memory, every long repressed sensation, became a vital piece of the puzzle, a testament to the power of recollection to pierce decades of darkness. For the broader community, the emergence of these truths was a complicated balm. Years of uncertainty, speculation, and quiet mourning gave way to tangible information. Yet the emotional landscape remained fractured. Families who had lived alongside the Powells, whose own lives had been quietly shadowed by the disappearance, now confronted a new reality. The loss had not been an isolated tragedy, but a ripple with consequences that had touched every corner of Somerset Street. The past and present merged in a way that was both enlightening and painful, forcing acknowledgement of the depth and permanence of grief. For Victoria's parents, the breakthrough was suffused with contradictions. Relief that someone was finally speaking, that the truth had begun to emerge, was mingled with a renewed, visceral pain. Every detail confirmed what they had long feared but never fully confronted. The subtle signs Victoria had displayed in her final days, the quiet hesitations, the small rituals of comfort and vigilance, now resonated with profound clarity. Her fears, once private and mysterious, were mirrored in the fragments of memory and fact that had finally come to light. The emotional weight of the breakthrough pressed upon the entire investigation. Officers retraced old paths, canvassed familiar streets, and revisited conversations that had once seemed inconsequential. Every witness became a potential conduit to understanding, every overlooked detail an opportunity to complete the picture. The community, too, became emotionally involved, offering recollections, photographs, and anecdotes, a collective effort to reconcile memory with fact, grief with truth, and in the quiet moments, when the neighborhood was still, the Powells returned to Victoria's room. The toys remained arranged as they had been left decades before, the wooden doll resting in the same place, the walls and floor holding the imprint of a life both vibrant and stolen. They allowed themselves a rare silence, listening not for answers, but for echoes, traces of the child who had lived, and the fragile threads of understanding now beginning to form from the fog of years. The long-buried truths had begun to surface, bringing clarity to a story that had been suspended in shadow for far too long. The emotional terrain of loss, hope, and revelation intertwined, leaving a resonance that was both cathartic and painful, a reminder that even decades of silence could not erase the enduring presence of love and memory. The revelation hit with the quiet inevitability of a storm rolling over the horizon. The pieces, once scattered and fragmented, aligned into a clarity that was both horrifying and, in a strange sense, necessary. The community of Somerset Street, long steeped in the muted tension of uncertainty, now faced a truth that cut sharply through the years, exposing the contours of a story that had remained hidden beneath layers of fear, forgetfulness, and sorrow. For the Powells, the emotional fallout was immediate and profound. Relief that answers were finally emerging was entangled with grief, sharpened by decades of absence. Victoria's mother, holding the wooden doll in her hands, felt a tremor that traveled to her chest, part recognition, part disbelief. The weight of years spent in anxious waiting, the nights of imagined scenarios and endless questioning, pressed against her now with renewed intensity. Each memory, each detail she had clung to, each subtle signal she had noticed in Victoria's final days, now bore a darker resonance, echoing the truth she had long feared but never fully faced. Her father, too, carried the revelation like a physical presence pressing against him. The quiet street he had walked countless times, retracing Victoria's imagined steps, now seemed charged with recognition. Each cracked sidewalk, every garden corner, every shadowed doorway, was a reminder of the fragility of that final day, a tactile and emotional testament to the life that had been lost. The clarity of the revelation did not ease the ache. It transformed it, sharpening the grief, giving it definition and direction, and making the absence feel heavier even as understanding emerged. The community's emotional response was complex. Neighbors who had once whispered among themselves now confronted the truth openly. Some wept quietly in their kitchens. Others sat in stunned silence on porches that had once witnessed the carefree rhythm of children at play. The long shadows of suspicion and unanswered questions lifted slightly, but the weight of knowing carried its own form of burden. Somerset Street had been a tableau of innocence interrupted, and the revelation painted every home, every lawn, every familiar corner with a sense of vigilance that would linger indefinitely. Investigators moved carefully, aware that the truth, though now visible, was fragile and raw. Evidence that had once been buried in file cabinets or forgotten in the margins of reports was now examined anew, each detail scrutinized with an awareness of both its factual and emotional significance. Every photograph, every note, every recollection from witnesses and neighbors became part of a mosaic that was finally taking form, revealing the contours of a story that had been suspended in silence for decades. The emotional resonance extended beyond the immediate family. Extended relatives, friends, and neighbors who had long carried the weight of uncertainty now confronted the reality of the events that had unfolded that summer. Letters exchanged, conversations long avoided, and memories that had lain dormant were revived, each one tinged with a mixture of sorrow, relief, and disbelief. The story, once confined to the private grief of a small family, now became a collective reckoning, a communal engagement with loss, memory, and the fragile nature of innocence. In Victoria's room, the echoes of her presence were palpable. The dolls remained arranged with the same meticulous care. The soft sunlight filtering through lace curtains illuminated patterns in the carpet she had once traced with her tiny fingers. The room became a space of reflection, mourning, and understanding, where memory and revelation coexisted. It held the weight of both the child who had been lost and the truth that had finally been uncovered. A quiet testament to the enduring presence of a life that had been brief yet profoundly felt. The revelation also brought a subtle shift in the emotional landscape of the investigators and the community. The uncertainty that had lingered for decades was replaced by a tense clarity. People moved through their familiar spaces with a heightened awareness, recognizing that the world had always carried the potential for fragility and danger, even in the most ordinary of neighborhoods. The weight of knowing replaced the weight of wondering, and with it came a mixture of solemn relief and quiet despair. Through it all, the Powells confronted the complex intersection of grief and closure. Understanding the truth did not erase the absence of Victoria's laughter, her soft footsteps, her curious gaze. It did, however, offer a framework for memory to exist alongside reality, allowing the fragments of her life to be honored, held, and remembered with a clarity that had long been denied. Every object, every detail of her brief existence became a conduit for reflection, a vessel for the emotions that had been accumulating in the silent spaces of home and neighborhood for decades. The revelation, though painful, illuminated the emotional landscape of the years that had followed. It exposed the full extent of longing, guilt, and sorrow that had shaped the Powell family and the Somerset Street community, while also offering the first true opportunity for comprehension, for acknowledgement, and perhaps for the slow beginnings of healing. In that quiet realization, the child's memory and the truth of her final days began to exist together, intertwined in a tapestry of grief and understanding, fragile but enduring. The final unraveling of Victoria Powell's story brought a convergence of emotion and fact that had eluded Somerset Street for over 3 decades. The fragments of memory, the whispers of long silent witnesses, the meticulously preserved evidence all coalesced into a narrative that was both devastating and In a perverse sense, complete. The community that had once moved through ordinary summer afternoons with quiet suspicion now confronted the raw, undeniable truth of what had happened on that warm day in 1954. For the Powells, the culmination was a crucible of feeling. Her mother, once stoic in the quiet persistence of grief, now felt the full spectrum of her sorrow and understanding crash over her. Every fragment of memory, Victoria's hesitant steps, the delicate arrangement of her toys, the private rituals of her final days now aligned with the narrative that had finally emerged. It was a bitter clarity, one that illuminated the precise contours of loss, but also rendered the emotional wound sharp and inescapable. She traced the familiar patterns in the carpet, held the worn wooden doll to her chest, and let herself feel the decades of restrained anguish spill over. A flood long denied. Her father's grief was quieter, but no less intense. Each step he took on Somerset Street felt heavy with history. Every cracked sidewalk and shadowed corner, a reminder of the life that had been stolen. In the final unraveling, he retraced Victoria's imagined paths with renewed understanding, confronting both the tangible facts and the ineffable absence that had defined their lives for so long. His chest tightened with the simultaneous weight of revelation and enduring emptiness, a tension that would linger indefinitely, a permanent echo of a child's brief existence. The neighborhood bore witness to the culmination with a mix of relief and renewed sorrow. Those who had once speculated quietly in the evenings, who had avoided mentioning the lost child to shield themselves from pain, now faced the reality of events with a stark clarity. Conversations that had been tentative and fragmented for decades became focused and deliberate. Shared memories resurfaced with poignant accuracy, the scent of crushed dandelions, the warmth of sunlit porches, the subtle hush of a summer breeze. Somerset Street, once a tableau of quiet suburban life, had become a living memorial to the child whose presence had once illuminated it, and whose absence had haunted it for decades. Investigators, now looking at the complete tapestry of events, pieced together the trajectory of that fateful day. The minutiae that had been previously overlooked, the pattern of shadows, fleeting glimpses, objects out of place now formed a coherent and chilling sequence. The details, once fragmentary, aligned into a narrative that illuminated the chaos of loss and the deliberate unfolding of an act that had stolen a life so young and so tender. The emotional gravity of the facts was inseparable from their precise chronology. Truth and grief entwined in every step of the reconstruction. For the wider community, the unraveling brought an undeniable shift. There was sorrow, of course, for the innocence lost and the time stolen, but there was also an understanding, a way to integrate the decades of absence into a coherent memory. The knowledge of what had transpired allowed people to frame the lingering unease that had always hovered over the street. They could walk past the gardens and the sidewalks and recall Victoria's bright curiosity, her delicate vigilance, her small hands tracing the patterns of her world. Without the gnawing uncertainty that had haunted them for generations dot in the quiet rooms of the Powell home, the culmination of truth reshaped memory. The dolls, the scattered toys, the sunlit floorboards all became sacred markers of a life interrupted but no longer obscured. Every corner of the house vibrated with the memory of the child who had once moved through it with cautious joy. The room itself became a vessel for both mourning and remembrance, an intimate space where love, grief, and understanding converged in the slow, deliberate rhythm of acceptance. The emotional peak of the unraveling was not found in the facts alone, but in the resonance they carried. Parents, neighbors, and investigators alike confronted the interweaving of joy, curiosity, fear, and absence that defined Victoria's short life. The stark clarity of the final sequence did not erase grief, but provided a framework for it, a structure in which sorrow and love could coexist. For the first time, The child who had been lost so long ago could be fully seen in both life and death, remembered with vivid presence rather than fractured shadows. And as Somerset Street settled into its evening hush, the community collectively exhaled. The story was complete, yet the emotional impact would linger indefinitely. The past and present now existed in tandem. The radiant curiosity of Victoria Powell, the tender vigilance of her final days, and the devastating rupture of her disappearance, all woven into the fabric of memory and truth. The long silence had ended, replaced by clarity, sorrow, and the quiet, enduring pulse of remembrance. The resolution of Victoria Powell's case left Somerset Street forever altered, though the transformation was subtle, felt more in memory and silence than in any physical change. The facts, once scattered and obscured by decades of uncertainty, now existed fully, articulated and acknowledged. Yet the emotional landscape remained complex, a tapestry woven from grief, love, and the delicate recognition of a life interrupted far too soon. Her parents navigated this new reality with tentative steps. The knowledge of what had transpired did not erase the absence that had defined so many years, but it provided a framework for remembrance, a way to hold the entirety of Victoria's brief life in their hearts without being consumed by the unrelenting unknown. Her mother lingered in her room, often tracing her daughter's toys with gentle fingers, whispering memories aloud into the stillness, allowing grief to mingle with pride and love. Her father walked the familiar sidewalks with a soft awareness of the child who had once traversed them. Each step a quiet act of acknowledgement, each memory a tribute to the resilience and brightness of her spirit. The neighborhood, too, carried the imprint of the resolution. Conversations shifted from tentative speculation to shared remembrance. Parents who had once feared for their own children now spoke openly of Victoria, recalling her curiosity, the delicate gestures of her small hands, the fleeting laughter that had once punctuated summer afternoons. Somerset Street had absorbed the truth and held it, a living testament to both the fragility and the vibrancy of a life cut short, a place where memory and history intertwined with the ordinary, textures of home and garden. Investigators and witnesses who had labored under decades of uncertainty found a measure of closure. The painstaking accumulation of recollections, evidence, and intuition had coalesced into a narrative that finally made sense. Yet even in the clarity of truth, there remained the emotional residue of what had been lost, the potential that would never unfold, the milestones that would never be reached, the ordinary joys and sorrows of childhood forever absent. The resolution did not erase grief, it reframed it, allowing sorrow and memory to coexist in a structure of understanding. Victoria's room remained a sanctuary, a vessel for remembrance. The wooden doll rested quietly in its familiar place, a symbol of both presence and absence, of innocence and resilience. Photographs yellowed with time captured the light in her eyes, the softness of her curls, the small gestures that defined her brief life. Every object became a conduit for emotion, a tangible bridge connecting the living to the memory of a child who had once embodied curiosity, caution, and the fragile poetry of being small in a vast world. The enduring lesson of Victoria Powell's story is found not only in the facts of her disappearance, but in the emotional truth she left behind. It is in the way grief shaped those who loved her, the way memory preserved her presence, and the way truth, once uncovered, allowed the delicate coexistence of sorrow and acknowledgement. Her life, though brief, left an indelible imprint, a quiet insistence that even in loss, there is remembrance, and even in absence, there is meaning. Somerset Street has since returned to the rhythms of ordinary life, yet it carries the memory of Victoria in every shadowed corner, every sunlit lawn, every gentle rustle of leaves. Her presence is remembered not as a story of horror alone, but as a testimony to the vibrancy, fragility, an emotional depth of a child who loved, observed, and existed fully in the fleeting span of 3 years. And when you're ready, click the video on the right to explore another case.